August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles over radios across Japan. For the first time in history, a Japanese emperor speaks directly to his people. His message is devastating. Japan surrenders. In Manchuria, northern China, a Japanese soldier named Yamada Ichiro hears the news. He's 23 years old. He's been fighting the Soviet army for 6 days, since the Soviets declared war on Japan on August 9. Now, suddenly, it's over. Yamada expects to go home. The war is finished. International law is clear. Prisoners of war must be repatriated promptly after hostilities end. He'll be processed, maybe spend a few months in detention, then return to his family in Osaka. He won't see Japan again until 1953. 8 years later. Yamada Ichiro was one of approximately 600,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians captured by Soviet forces in the final days of World War II. The official story, the one told by the Soviet Union for decades, was that these prisoners were repatriated by 1950. That was a lie. Tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners remained in Soviet camps throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Some died there. Others were released only after Stalin's death in 1953, when the new Soviet leadership needed to improve relations with Japan. This is the story the Allies didn't want to talk about. The POW camps that stayed open long after liberation. The prisoners the world forgot. The betrayal that happened while everyone was celebrating victory. To understand what happened to these prisoners, we need to go back to August 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany surrendered in May. But in the Pacific, Japan fights on. By August, Japan is already defeated. American firebombing has destroyed most of its major cities. The naval blockade has strangled its economy. The Japanese military is shattered. But the government refuses to surrender unconditionally. President Truman faces a terrible choice: invade Japan and suffer potentially millions of casualties, or use the newly developed atomic bomb. On August 6, an atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima. 70,000 people die instantly. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb obliterates Nagasaki. 40,000 dead. But something else happens on August 9, something that may have been even more important to Japan's decision to surrender. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan. For 4 years, Japan and the Soviet Union had maintained an uneasy neutrality. Stalin was focused on Germany. He had no interest in fighting a two-front war. But at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Stalin kept his promise. Exactly 3 months after Germany surrendered, the Soviet Union attacks. The invasion is massive. 1.5 million Soviet troops pour across the border into Manchuria, which Japan has occupied since 1931. The Japanese Guangdong Army, once considered Japan's elite force, is a shell of its former self. The best troops and equipment have been sent to defend the home islands. What remains in Manchuria is poorly trained, under-equipped, and outnumbered 5-1. The Soviet offensive is devastating. Using tactics perfected against Germany, Soviet tank armies smash through Japanese defenses. The Guangdong Army collapses. Within days, Soviet forces are advancing hundreds of miles, capturing entire Japanese units. Yamada Ichiro is a private in the 126th Infantry Division, stationed near the city of Mudanjiang. When the Soviet attack begins, his unit is ordered to delay the enemy advance. It's a suicide mission, and everyone knows it. His unit fights for 3 days. Then the ammunition runs out. On August 12, 3 days before Japan's surrender, Yamada and the surviving members of his company are surrounded. They have no choice but to surrender. He becomes a Soviet prisoner of war. 6 days later, Japan officially surrenders. Yamada expects his captivity will be brief. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war must be returned home promptly after the end of hostilities. The war is over. Surely he'll be going home soon. He's wrong. The Soviets have other plans. Let me give you the numbers, because they're staggering. Between August 9th and September 2nd, less than a month, Soviet forces capture approximately 600,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians in Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. 600,000 people. That's more prisoners than the United States captured during the entire Pacific War. Now the Soviets face a logistical problem. What do you do with 600,000 prisoners? Where do you put them? How do you feed them? How do you guard them? The answer comes from Moscow, in a directive signed by Joseph Stalin himself. The prisoners will not be repatriated immediately. Instead, they will be used for labor. They will rebuild the Soviet Union. You have to understand the context. The Soviet Union is devastated. The war with Germany killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Entire cities are rubble. The industrial base is shattered. Roads, bridges, railways, all destroyed. The Soviet people are starving, exhausted, traumatized. Stalin needs labor to rebuild. Free labor. And suddenly, he has 600,000 Japanese prisoners. In late August and early September 1945, the Japanese prisoners begin their journey. They're loaded onto trains, cattle cars, really, and transported north and west. Some go to Siberia. Others to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, the Soviet Far East. The journey takes weeks, sometimes months. The prisoners are given minimal food. Water is scarce. Sanitation is non-existent. Many die on the trains from disease, starvation, or exposure. Yamada Ichiro ends up in a camp in Khabarovsk, in the Soviet Far East. It's technically a labor camp, but it's really a prison. Barbed wire. Guard towers. Armed soldiers. The prisoners sleep in barracks that were built for the German prisoners who preceded them. The conditions are harsh. The daily ration is 700 grams of bread and watery soup. Sometimes there's fish. Usually not. In winter, temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The barracks are heated by a single stove that barely makes a difference. But the worst part is the work. Every day, the prisoners are marched out to work sites. They build roads. They construct railways. They work in mines and lumber camps. They clear forests. They dig canals. The workday is 10 hours. Sometimes 12. If you don't meet your quota, your rations are cut. If you're sick, you work anyway unless you can't stand. If you collapse, you're dragged back to the barracks and left there. If you die, your body is buried in an unmarked grave. This is August 1945. September. October. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. But for Yamada and hundreds of thousands like him, the war continues in a different form. And here's the thing that makes this even worse. The world doesn't know. Or rather, the world chooses not to know. In late 1945 and early 1946, families in Japan begin to ask questions. Where are their sons, fathers, brothers? The war is over. The surrender was signed in September. Why haven't the prisoners come home? The Japanese government submits inquiries to the Allied occupation authorities. General Douglas MacArthur's staff forwards these questions to Moscow. The Soviet response is evasive. They acknowledge holding some Japanese prisoners. They claim the prisoners are being well treated and will be repatriated soon. But months pass. Then years. And the prisoners don't come home. In 1946, the Soviet Union officially announces that it holds 594,000 Japanese prisoners. The number is suspiciously precise. Later evidence suggests the real number was higher, possibly 700,000 or more, but that tens of thousands had already died by the time the Soviets did the count. The Soviets also make a promise. All prisoners will be repatriated by the end of 1947. The Japanese government and the families cling to this promise. The promise is broken. By the end of 1947, approximately 450,000 prisoners have been returned to Japan. That sounds like a lot. But it leaves 150,000 still in Soviet custody. and the repatriations stop. Why? What changed? The Cold War. By 1947, the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers is collapsing. The Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. The Soviet Union sees the United States as an enemy, and Japan, under American occupation, is now firmly in the American camp. Stalin decides the remaining Japanese prisoners are still useful. They can continue working, or they can be used as political leverage. Maybe both. But there's another, darker reason some prisoners are not released. Some prisoners have been classified as war criminals. Not major war criminals, those are being tried in Tokyo. These are prisoners the Soviets accuse of crimes against Soviet citizens or Soviet interests. The definition of war criminal is conveniently broad. It can include anyone who fought against Soviet forces, anyone who worked in the Japanese occupation government in Manchuria, anyone who expressed anti-Soviet views, anyone the Soviets want to keep. Approximately 2,000 Japanese prisoners are tried by Soviet military tribunals between 1945 and 1950. The trials are secret. There are no defense attorneys. The charges are often vague. The evidence is whatever the prosecutor says it is. The sentences range from 10 years to 25 years to death. Executions are carried out immediately, usually by firing squad. The bodies are buried in unmarked graves. The families are never notified. Let me tell you about one case. His name was Kuroki Tadashi. He was a civilian administrator in Manchuria. His job was managing railway logistics. When the Soviets invaded, he was captured. In 1947, Kuroki was put on trial. The charge: participating in anti-Soviet activities. The evidence: he had worked for the Japanese government, which occupied Manchuria, which the Soviets considered anti-Soviet. The trial lasted 1 day. He was sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp. Kuroki's family didn't know any of this. They were simply told he hadn't returned with the other prisoners. They assumed he was dead. Kuroki actually survived. He was released in 1956, 11 years after the war ended, as part of a Soviet-Japanese diplomatic agreement. When he returned to Japan, his family had held a funeral for him 8 years earlier. His wife had remarried. His children didn't recognize him. This was not an isolated case. There are thousands of similar stories. Meanwhile, in the camps, the prisoners who remain are wondering, why us? Why haven't we been sent home? Yamada Ichiro keeps a diary. It's forbidden. Prisoners are not allowed to have paper or writing materials, but he steals scraps of paper and makes ink from soot and water. He writes in tiny characters to save space. He hides the pages inside his mattress. In January 1948, 2.5 years after Japan's surrender, he writes, "Another year begins. Still in this place. The guards say we will go home soon. They have been saying this for 2 years. I no longer believe them. Today, 3 men from our barracks were taken away. We were told they were being transferred. We know what that means." What did it mean? Sometimes it meant genuine transfer to another camp. Sometimes it meant trial and execution. Sometimes it meant the prisoner was sick or injured and being taken to die somewhere out of sight. The mortality rate in the camps is difficult to determine precisely because Soviet records are incomplete and often falsified. But Japanese government estimates, based on survivor testimony and post-Soviet document releases, suggest that approximately 60,000 Japanese prisoners died in Soviet custody between 1945 and 1956. 60,000 deaths. That's 10% of the total captured. Causes of death: malnutrition, disease, exposure, accidents, and execution. The world knows almost nothing about this. Why? Because the Soviet Union lies about it. And because the Allies, including the United States, don't push too hard for the truth. Here's the uncomfortable reality. In the late 1940s, the U.S. government is aware that thousands of Japanese prisoners remain in Soviet camps. American intelligence has testimony from repatriated prisoners. They know the conditions are brutal. They know people are dying. But the United States doesn't make a major diplomatic issue of it. Why not? Because it's complicated. The U.S. is focused on rebuilding Japan and integrating it into the anti-Soviet alliance. Making noise about Japanese prisoners in Soviet camps would anger Moscow at a time when the U.S. is trying to avoid direct confrontation. It would also potentially embarrass Japan, which is supposed to be America's new ally and democracy model for Asia. There's also a darker calculation. The United States itself is not entirely clean on prisoner repatriation issues. At the end of the war, the U.S. forcibly repatriated approximately 2 million Soviet citizens to the USSR under Operation Keelhaul, many of them to certain death or imprisonment. The U.S. doesn't want to invite scrutiny of its own actions. So the Japanese prisoners in Soviet camps are forgotten. Not officially, there are occasional diplomatic notes and inquiries, but practically, they become a footnote. An unfortunate legacy. Something to be quietly resolved when possible. But for the men in the camps, being a footnote means years more of forced labor, starvation, and death. Let me take you inside one of these camps. This is based on testimony from survivors, including Yamada Ichiro, who wrote extensively about his experience after his eventual return to Japan. The camp is designated Labor Camp 305, located near Komsomolsk-on-Amur in the Soviet Far East. It holds approximately 2,000 Japanese prisoners. They work primarily in logging operations, cutting timber from the Siberian forests. The daily routine is rigid and brutal. 5 a.m., wake-up call. The guards bang on metal pipes. You have 15 minutes to get dressed, use the latrine, and line up for roll call. 5:15 a.m., roll call. You stand outside regardless of weather. In winter, it's still dark and often below freezing. Roll call takes 30 minutes because the guards recount several times. If anyone is missing, everyone stands there until the missing person is found. 6 a.m., breakfast. A piece of black bread. A cup of hot water that might have seen grain at some point, which passes for tea. That's it. 6:30 a.m., march to the worksite. This can be 2 or 3 miles from the camp. You walk there. No transportation. If it's snowing or raining, you walk anyway. 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., work. 11 hours. Cutting trees with saws. Loading logs onto carts. Moving timber. The quota is specific. Each prisoner must process a certain number of cubic meters of wood per day. If the group doesn't meet quota, everyone's rations are cut that night. 6 p.m., march back to camp. 7 p.m., dinner. Watery soup. Maybe a small piece of fish or fat if you met quota. Another piece of bread. On good days, there's a potato. Good days are rare. 7:30 p.m., free time. Except there's nothing to do. No books. No paper. No radio. You sit or lie down. You try to stay warm. You try not to think about home. 9 p.m., lights out. You sleep on wooden bunks with thin blankets. In winter, you sleep in your clothes with your coat on. You wake up several times during the night from cold. Then you do it again. Every day. 4 years. Disease is rampant. Dysentery. Pneumonia. Tuberculosis. Frostbite in winter. Infected wounds from logging accidents. The camp has a medical facility, but it's barely functional. 1 doctor for 2,000 men. Almost no medicine. If you're seriously ill, you're sent to a hospital camp. If you're sent to the hospital camp, you probably die there. The psychological toll is as bad as the physical. The prisoners don't know when or if they'll be released. Rumors circulate constantly. We're going home next month. Stalin promised repatriation by year's end. The Japanese government is negotiating for us. None of it is true, but the prisoners cling to hope because hope is all they have. Some prisoners break mentally. They stop eating. Stop talking. Stop working. The guards call them self-willed deaths. The prisoners have a different term, giving up the spirit. Yamada writes in his diary, March 1949, Tanaka from my barracks died yesterday. He was 26. He simply stopped. Stopped eating. Stopped speaking. 3 days later, he was gone. The guards took his body away. We don't know where they bury us. There are no markers. When I die here, my family will never know where I am. But here's what's remarkable. Many prisoners don't break. They find ways to survive. To maintain their humanity. They create a secret school. Educated prisoners teach younger ones. History. Mathematics. Literature. Everything is oral because there's no paper. Students memorize lessons. They recite them to each other to reinforce memory. If the guards discover the school, punishment is severe. But the prisoners continue because learning keeps their minds active. It gives them purpose beyond survival. They hold ceremonies. When someone dies, the prisoners conduct a Buddhist funeral in secret. They have no priest, no incense, no ritual items. But they gather in the barracks at night and recite prayers from memory. They bow toward the east, toward Japan, toward home. They resist in small ways. Soviet propaganda officers periodically visit the camps to conduct political education sessions. The prisoners are supposed to learn about communism and renounce Japanese imperialism. Most prisoners sit silently through these sessions, saying nothing. When asked questions, they give non-answers. It's a quiet form of resistance. Some prisoners try to escape. It's nearly impossible. The camps are surrounded by wilderness. Hundreds of miles from any city. The terrain is forest or tundra. There are no roads. Winter is deadly. If the guards don't catch you, the cold will kill you. Or wolves. Or starvation. Yamada records 3 escape attempts from his camp between 1946 and 1950. All 3 failed. 2 escapees were recaptured within days and shot. 1 was never found. Presumably he died in the forest. And yet, despite everything, the prisoners endure. Why? For most, the answer is simple. They have families waiting at home. Parents. Wives. Children. They promised to return. That promise keeps them alive. Yamada writes, December 1950, 5 years now. 5 winters in this place. Today I thought I might give up. The cold is unbearable. My hands are damaged from frostbite. I can barely hold the saw. Then I remembered my mother's face. She is waiting. I promised I would come home. So I must survive 1 more day. Tomorrow I will make the same promise again. By 1950, even the Soviet Union recognizes that holding these prisoners indefinitely is becoming problematic. Stalin is dead by 1953. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev wants to improve relations with Japan. Japan has something the Soviets want: diplomatic recognition and trade. In 1953, the Soviet Union begins releasing the remaining Japanese prisoners. Not all at once. Slowly. As part of negotiations. But for thousands of prisoners, the release comes too late. 8 years after the war ended. The first group of long-term Japanese prisoners boards a ship in the Soviet port of Nakotka. They're going home. Yamada Ichiro is among them. He's 31 years old. When he was captured, he was 23. He's lost 8 years. The best years of his life, spent cutting timber in Siberia. The ship crosses the Sea of Japan and arrives at the port of Maizuru. This is where repatriation ships have been docking since 1945. But these returnees are different. They're the forgotten ones. The prisoners everyone assumed were dead. As the ship pulls into port, the prisoners see Japan for the first time in nearly a decade. Many are crying. Some are praying. Others just stare in silence. When they disembark, they're processed by Japanese authorities. Medical checks. Paperwork. Debriefing. The government wants to know what happened. How they were treated. How many died. Who's still there? But something is wrong. The prisoners can feel it. Japan has changed. Radically. When they left in 1945, Japan was a devastated empire, defeated but still culturally intact. Now, in 1953, Japan is unrecognizable. It's occupied by American forces. The emperor has renounced his divinity. The country is rebuilding under democratic reforms. American movies, American music, American influence is everywhere. The prisoners feel like strangers in their own country. Yamada takes a train to Osaka, to his family home. The train is clean, modern, crowded with prosperous-looking people. He's wearing a donated suit that doesn't fit. He feels everyone is staring at him, though probably they're not. He arrives at the address where his family lived. The house is gone. Destroyed in American bombing raids in 1945 and rebuilt. Someone else lives there now. A neighbor tells him his family moved. He gets the new address. He finds the house. His mother answers the door. She's aged 20 years in 8. She stares at him. Doesn't recognize him at first. Then she screams. Falls to her knees. Weeps. His father comes to the door. He looks at Yamada for a long moment. Then he says, "We thought you were dead. We held a funeral. We have a memorial tablet for you." Yamada has a younger sister. She was 14 when he left. Now she's 22, married, with a child. She looks at him like he's a ghost. Which, in a way, he is. Over the next days and weeks, Yamada tries to reintegrate. It's impossibly difficult. He has nightmares. Wakes up screaming. His family doesn't understand. How can he explain? How can he describe what he's been through to people who've never experienced it? He can't eat normal portions. His stomach, after years of starvation rations, can't handle it. He gets sick. He's hypervigilant. Loud noises startle him. He's constantly aware of exits. He hoards food. His mother finds bread hidden in his room. He can't explain why. The psychological term doesn't exist yet in 1953, but Yamada has what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he gets no treatment because the concept of trauma therapy barely exists in 1950s Japan. He tries to find work. But what can he do? He spent 8 years cutting timber in a labor camp. He has no skills relevant to modern Japan. He has no education beyond high school. And employers are reluctant to hire returnees from Soviet camps. There's a stigma. Were they brainwashed? Are they communists now? Can they be trusted? Yamada eventually finds work as a day laborer. Manual work. Low pay. It's not a career. It's survival. He's not alone. Thousands of returned prisoners face similar challenges. Some adapt. Some don't. Some turn to alcohol. Some become reclusive. Some never fully recover. And here's what makes it worse. The Japanese government doesn't want to talk about them. The return of these prisoners is an embarrassment. It reminds Japan of its defeat. It raises questions about why the government didn't do more to get them home earlier. It complicates Japan's relationship with the Soviet Union, with whom Japan is trying to negotiate a peace treaty. So the returned prisoners are quietly forgotten. Again, there's no official recognition. No compensation. No support services. They're just expected to reintegrate and move on. Yamada lives the rest of his life in Osaka. He marries in 1957. Has 2 children. Works various manual labor jobs. He never talks about his time in the Soviet camps except to other returnees. His wife asks once. He says, "You can't understand. I hope you never can." In 1985, 40 years after his capture, a Japanese historian contacts Yamada. There's a project to document the experiences of prisoners in Soviet camps. Would Yamada be willing to share his story? Yamada is 63 years old. He's retired. His children are grown. He finally agrees to talk. He provides his diary, the one he kept in secret in the camps and somehow managed to bring home. It's falling apart. Pages are missing. But it's an extraordinary document. One of the few first-hand accounts that survived. He sits for hours of interviews. Tells stories he's never told his family. Describes the cold, the hunger, the fear, the deaths, the small acts of resistance and humanity that kept them alive. Near the end of the interviews, the historian asks, "What do you want people to know? Why is it important to tell this story?" Yamada thinks for a long time. Then he says, "I want people to know that we didn't just disappear. We didn't die in the war, and that was that. We were kept in camps for years after the war ended. We were forgotten by our government. Forgotten by our families who thought we were dead. Forgotten by the world. And thousands of us died there because no one cared enough to bring us home. I survived. I came back. But I want people to remember the ones who didn't. They deserve to be remembered." Yamada dies in 1998, at the age of 76. His family publishes excerpts of his diary and the historian's interviews. The book gets some attention in Japan but doesn't become widely known internationally. The story remains, largely, forgotten. Let's talk about numbers. Because numbers matter when we're discussing forgotten prisoners. Official Soviet records, released after the collapse of the USSR, state that 594,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were captured in August 1945. Of these, 539,000 were repatriated between 1946 and 1950. Another 55,000 were repatriated between 1951 and 1956. That's 594,000 captured. 594,000 accounted for. The math works out. Case closed. Except it doesn't. Because we know from multiple sources that the Soviet numbers are false. Japanese government investigations, conducted over decades, suggest that at least 640,000 people were captured. Maybe as many as 700,000. The discrepancy exists because the Soviets didn't count civilians. They didn't count people who died in the first weeks of captivity before reaching the camps. They didn't count people who were executed without trial. So how many actually died in Soviet custody? The Japanese government's official estimate is approximately 60,000. But the real number is probably higher. Maybe 70,000. Maybe 80,000. We'll never know exactly because complete records don't exist. What we do know is that approximately 60,000 confirmed deaths is 10% of the official prisoner count. That's 1 in 10. For comparison, the death rate for American prisoners in Japanese camps was about 27%. The death rate for Soviet prisoners in German camps was over 50%. So 10% might sound relatively low. But here's the critical difference. Those other deaths occurred during active warfare. The Japanese prisoners in Soviet camps died after the war was over. They died while being held in violation of international law. They died while the world did nothing. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the Soviet Union never signed but which represented international norms, stated clearly that prisoners of war must be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of hostilities. The Potsdam Declaration of July 1945, which established the terms of Japan's surrender, specifically stated that Japanese forces would be disarmed and returned home. The Soviet Union violated both these principles. And the international community did essentially nothing about it. Why? Why did the world forget these prisoners? Part of the answer is Cold War politics. By the time the extent of the issue became clear, 1947, 1948, the Soviet Union was no longer an ally. It was an adversary. But it was also a nuclear-armed adversary. The United States and its allies had to choose their battles carefully. Japanese prisoners in Soviet camps were not worth risking a major confrontation. Part of the answer is that Japan itself had limited leverage. Japan was occupied, demilitarized. Its sovereignty was limited. The Japanese government could protest, but it couldn't force the Soviet Union to do anything. And part of the answer, uncomfortable as it is that many people simply didn't care. Japan had been the aggressor. Japan had committed atrocities across Asia. The suffering of Japanese soldiers in Soviet camps was, in some eyes, a form of justice. Not official justice. Not legal justice. But karmic justice. This thinking is morally wrong, but it existed. And it contributed to the inaction. The full truth about the Japanese prisoners in Soviet camps didn't emerge until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and archives were opened. Japanese historians and government officials spent years combing through Soviet documents, interviewing survivors, piecing together what happened. What they found was a systematic program of forced labor, brutal conditions, falsified records, and deliberate obfuscation. The Soviet government lied about how many prisoners it held. It lied about how many died. It lied about when they were released. And the Soviet government destroyed evidence. When prisoners died, their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. When camps were closed, records were destroyed. When survivors asked about missing comrades, they were told no information was available. To this day, there are approximately 30,000 Japanese prisoners whose fates are unknown. They were captured in 1945. They never came home. Soviet records indicate they died in custody, but provide no details. Where are they buried? How did they die? We don't know. Their families never got answers. Imagine that. Your father, brother, son goes to war. He's captured. You hear nothing for years. Then finally, a government official tells you, "We believe he died in Soviet custody, probably in the late 1940s. We don't know where. We don't know how. There's no grave we can show you. We're sorry." That's the reality for thousands of Japanese families. In the late 1990s and 2000s, the Japanese government negotiated with Russia, the Soviet Union's successor state, for more information. Some documents were provided. Some remains were returned. But Russia has been reluctant to fully open all relevant archives. Even now, there are files that remain classified. Why? What could still be sensitive, more than 70 years later? The answer is probably that those files contain evidence of war crimes. Executions without trial. Deliberate starvation. Deaths from neglect. The kind of things that could create legal liability or political embarrassment. So the final accounting remains incomplete. We know approximately what happened. We know it was wrong. But we don't know everything. And we never will. Let me end with one more story. One more person. Her name was Yamada Haruko. She was Yamada Ichiro's mother. When her son was captured in 1945, she waited. Every day, she waited for news. In 1946, some prisoners came home. He wasn't among them. In 1947, more came home. Still no Ichiro. By 1948, she assumed he was dead. The family held a funeral. They created a memorial tablet with his name. They mourned. But Haruko never fully accepted it. She kept waiting. Against all reason, against all evidence, she kept believing her son might come home. In 1953, when Ichiro finally did return, Haruko was 58 years old. She'd spent 8 years in limbo. Not quite a widow, because her son wasn't married. Not quite bereaved, because she'd never let herself fully grieve. Just waiting. When Ichiro came back, Haruko didn't ask many questions. She didn't press him for details about what happened. She just held him and cried and thanked the ancestors for bringing him home. She lived for another 15 years. She died in 1968, at age 73. Before she died, she told her daughter, "The 8 years he was gone were the hardest of my life. Harder than the war. Harder than losing our home to the bombs. Because I didn't know. Not knowing is worse than knowing the worst." That's what the forgotten prisoners represent. Not just their own suffering, though that was real and severe, but the suffering of everyone who loved them.